Hi, this is Dave Bartosiewicz. I am so excited. I'm with Bryan Jensen. You know Bryan. He's been with me for a number of years, doing great videos with many different subjects. And he actually came down here. I've been a teacher here at the Dixie University in the ICL division, and it's a continual learning. And so I'm teaching about the history of the early church, which is the first 500 years. And Bryan, as you know, watching other videos, he's been very, his intellect, his understanding, his education is much higher than a lot of people, especially with me, Bryan. I'm humbled to say that. That he knows a lot. So he was able to give a very good class. He prepared for about 4 days, and he came down, and there were about 50 people or so that truly enjoyed it. And he was talking about the heresies and the heretics. And so that was exciting. We've done shows about that. If you actually want to watch any shows, we've done, a show is Mormonism a restoration of these heresies? Do you remember doing that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we are going to talk about something else today, and we wanted to share some things, because whenever I have Bryan here, it's such a delight, and we've had an enjoyable time here the past 2 to 3 days. And one of the things we want to talk about is the temple, and how the temple in Mormonism, when you look at Mormonism, you look at a perspective that they restored this temple idea coming to Joseph Smith, and there are all these different parts of the temple, the restoration of the fonts, the restoration of the handshakes, the tokens, the restoration of this eternal marriage view, and that it was supposedly, if you have a restoration, you have what? You have
continuity.
It was something before that was going on, right? And they restored it. That failed, right?
Reinitiated it.
Exactly. So what we're going to be talking about, and I'm going to give Bryan the microphone in just a second, but these are some of the ideas. There are a lot of people who are Mormon, and they think, oh, well, Joseph Smith received this revelation because it failed and it needed to come back. So I wanted you to talk about the concept of first of all, what the temple was in King Solomon, and if there were more than just one temple at a time. I know that the LDS Church has how many temples? Like 170 now or so, and they're growing 12 to 15 a year for the next 10 years. And the next thing I want to ask you is if there's any truth regarding the Jewish temple to the Mormon temple, or was there a Christian temple after Christ came and the early church started? Was there a temple? And if there was, what kind of temple was that? So I'll give it to you, and hopefully this will be of interest to many people.
Well, I think one place where they take it is to say, why did the temple exist among the early Hebrew peoples, and then as the United Kingdom was founded, that it came to be constructed in the so-called Solomon's Temple. And so we would more commonly just call this the First Temple period rather than Solomon's Temple. But he certainly was significant in terms of carrying through what his father had initiated as would be a high priority, that this would be a building that would be constructed where not only all the peoples would come together as a central place of worship, where they believed literally that God's presence was housed there in an area called the Holy of Holies in the inner sanctum, but they believed it was a place where all the nations would come to recognize that God had a people and that he cared about the humanity. So, for example, we read that after Solomon created that temple and it began, that the Queen of Sheba came to the Solomon's Temple, and that, of course, was a symbolic sign in the eyes of the authors of Kings and Chronicles that this showed that the Gentile nations could recognize the special role that Israel had to serve.
All right.
So we go from that point, and what is special about First Temple that changes in the time of Second Temple?
Okay.
So the Northern Kingdom, which was Israel, gets sacked by the Assyrians, and then about 100 years later, the Babylonians come and have 3 sacks of Jerusalem that ultimately results in the destruction of the first temple, and in those waves various elites and people are taken away into Babylonia, and the Hebrew religion takes on a significant restructuring of the way it thinks about itself, because it's been, as we would say, the diaspora, it's been scattered abroad.
Okay.
And how do we see our worship and our relationship with God in that time?
Yeah, especially when there's no more temple.
Right.
That
right.
has been very difficult.
And so then some people eventually, roughly 70 years after that, they begin to come back. And that leads a point where we read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that the second temple is restructured.
Okay.
And that exists for a period until it's later sacked by again and desecrated by invasion from the Greek king Antiochus IV.
Wow.
So in that period, however, we have to remember that Jews had been scattered abroad, and thus has begun in this period, even though a temple exists in Judea, they have started early forms of synagogal worship, which is they begin to see themselves as living out in the way that they treat others and doing good deeds, making alms to the poor and to the needy. They begin to see that as we live the Torah, the law of God, we show God's love and favor for ourselves and for others through the way we live and interrelate with each other. But meanwhile, in Judea, the first temple has been replaced by the second temple. In the second temple, a number...
And what period of time again? What are we looking at exactly, the years?
So the first temple is sacked like 597, as I'm going off the top of my head. And then roughly 70 years after that, they begin to...
That was BC, obviously.
BC, yeah. And they begin to return. And then I'm trying to remember how long Ezra and Nehemiah describes the temple taking to reconstruct the second temple. I'm a little lost on my memory because we're
dates.
Right, because we're just going off memory as we create this today. But then later on, as we would have in the books called the Maccabees, we have a great uprising against the desecration of the second temple by the Greeks, and later that second temple gets added to and made much more beautiful and splendorous by Herod, who to the Jews was a great offense that he... In one hand, they're happy that he's making the temple a broader symbol, but they see it as a symbol to him more than a symbol to God, because he's ultimately not one of them. He's somebody who has obtained power by making peace with the Romans, who will grant power. So Judaism at this time becomes very sectarian, where some are very favorable views toward the temple and some very negative views toward the temple. And then in the midst of that, we have the Samaritans, which often are talked about very unfavorably because they are diaspora Jews who came back to the northern kingdom years later, and they said, we understand our faith a little bit different. We even understand where the temple ought to be different based on the same holy books that you revere. And these tensions between interpretation and what it meant symbolically leads to this great divide. But in the Christian era, we see very early the diaspora Jews who are already have negative views toward the temple. The early Christians adopt basically the festival calendar of people like the Essenes, who are a very strict sect.
They left the Dead Sea.
Yeah, they had left. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls today, largely through what they kept. And we also have people like John the Baptizer, who his father is one of the priestly class. Zacharias, but yet he doesn't preach cleanliness by going to the temple, which would be at times and seasons of the festival calendar. You would go and make a sacrifice at the temple. You would have ritual washings and cleanliness, and you would be more or less, you'd be among your community seen as clean and favorable because you have made your worship at the temple. Well, we have John the Baptist. What is he doing? He's out in a dirty river,
eating locusts,
living the unclean lifestyle, as it were, from the point of the view of the temple priesthood, and saying cleanliness and favor of God is found out here, away from that. And so early Christianity has a very Jewish worldview that's more in that way of looking at things than it is the way of those who were among Judea.
Okay.
So if we were to say the Mormons are going to restore a temple, you'd have to say which temple?
Yeah, was it the first?
The first or the second? Because the second temple had lost the Ark of the Covenant, which was the most significant symbolic object in the temple, because not only did it house the budding rod of Aaron and the Ten Commandments, so therefore it's seen as a place to hold these holy objects that show that God cares about them and he's been literally physically present among them.
Got it.
But it's also seen as the mercy seat, where both the high priest would proceed, and the kingly priest was seen as the anointed high priest, who was a sign that God's favor was present among the people. Yeah. And this is completely lost in the time of the Second Temple.
Yeah, but there were sacrificial
Yep, sacrificial offerings that maintained and that continued on. Right. But some of the holy objects were changed or lost in the time of the First and Second Temple.
So let's go now to the Christian world and what happened after Christ. I mean, we know that there was a transformation after Christ, and we know one of the key things is that the Holy Spirit came in now and it dwells in us, right? So that we become a holy temple ourselves, in essence. But at the same time, was there a place where Christians would go and have this sort of temple rituals in any way, like the Jewish believed?
Well, yes and no. So if we said, was it ever practiced the way the Mormon LDS faith practices their, what we would say, ordinances? No, that never existed.
Never.
In the Christian era, nor in the ancient era.
And
However,
that's absolute fact, right?
That's an absolute certainty.
So,
and part of the reason is because it goes back to not just merely the way things happen, but why things happen. Okay? So there's no reason in the Jewish worldview, nor the Christian worldview, that one has to perform things on behalf of those who've gone before to have favor with God. Because ultimately the reason we do things is for the purpose of how we belong in the here and now with the people among us. And then how does that transform us so that others who see us in a way understand the favor of God for all? That's basically the Jewish worldview. So the Christians definitely pivot on that, for sure, because they no longer see that there's one place everyone goes, but that every house of worship is now a temple. And so we would see that today throughout the Orthodox world, that all the churches are essentially called temples. Everyone is invited in. There's no more Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, in the unity of God.
No separation.
And so the book of Hebrews, I think we did a video about the book of Hebrews. That might be worth looking back to understand why Christians saw that as significant. Nonetheless, while there is continuity of symbolic meaning between the Christian expression of the temple and the old temple, for example, the loaves of presence, the shewbread that was in the old temple, Christians came to see that as the Eucharistic meal. In other words, in the old period, the loaves of bread would be eaten by the priests, and by that it was said it would confer most holiness. And most holiness meant that God was present with the people, that he was in them and transforming them to the outside, and then they would reflect that to their people, Israel, round.
Well, that's
through their work.
Part of the
and that is part
Christian
of that's part of the early Christian church, is to see the Eucharistic meal as doing that. It is conferring God's presence with the people, making that present in their life through the Spirit, so that as they do good alms and good deeds and all those things out among the people, that people see, God's favor is with the world and with the people.
Beautiful idea. So what we're seeing right here is the transformation of a physical temple became the actual presence, the real presence of Christ when one participates in the Eucharist, because in the early church, and I know with the apostolic fathers, they believed in this transformation
Right.
of the bread and the wine coming together through prayer, through the Holy Spirit,
as a mystical
unity of the real
presence.
presence of Christ.
Right.
So that was done from the very, very beginning. So
Right.
when we see that, that's the essence of the temple, having that temple experience within you now. And Christ said that in John 6,
Right.
I think from John 6:53
Right.
all the way to 66, you get to see
Right.
that.
Right.
So you could read that yourself and get to understand that a little bit more. So there was no such thing as a place afterwards in the Christian having all these rituals, these handshakes, nothing. So in a restoration that had to be restored from something in the past, we do not see absolutely no temple
Yeah.
like the Mormon temple.
Yeah, and
so if there was only one temple,
Right. And
not
so
hundreds.
if we were to take the Mormon temple system, I don't fault it at all for saying we have this way of doing things and we see it as significant for our relationship with God and with
Yeah.
Christ, because the Christians more or less had reinterpreted the original symbols to mean something else. But what is significant is that the Mormon temple construct, through its ritual, creates the idea that people in doing this are bringing ordinances that are necessary for the dead who have gone before to be reconciled with God,
And that was
for
never-
the ultimate kingdom. And that was never
We don't see any
that was
of that.
never a worldview that was present ever anciently, nor in the Christian era.
Okay.
So that's where I personally myself have more of a disagreement in the worldview conflict, that there's no continuity of worldview nor purposefulness with the Mormon temple system versus the ancient temple system. Therefore, it's not a restoration.
Yeah.
But the fact that the symbols pivot differently, this always happens with different people groups through religious history. So one can't really say, oh, they're merely, sometimes people say, oh, the Mormons are just pagans, because of the continuity, for example, with Masonry.
Yeah.
Yes, that exists, but at the same time, Mormons don't see it the same way Masonry does. So therefore, it becomes a personal matter. Does that bother you or offend you? But it doesn't really strike at the heart of, is it a restoration?
I mean, that's a key thing. When
Yes.
they make something of a substantial claim
Right.
as a restoration, then you have to prove it historically.
Right, I think
right?
so.
And you have to also prove it not only historically, but in a way which we have done, which you have just done, to show that it was never a part of the early Christian church. So if you cannot prove it or show it and claim that it's a restoration, then ultimately it's an add-on. It's an add-on. It's a view or opinion. It's a perspective that, I believe this is what it should be, right? But if you look at the view of the Mormon concept, the Mormon view in the temple, ultimately, what does it say? It says that in order to get into this temple, it's like the Jews of the old.
Right.
You have to what? You have to do all these things,
Right.
and you have to be so-called worthy by doing these things and pay a tithing, and then now you're worthy to enter the temple.
Right.
When Christ came, that wasn't that way anymore.
In which
It
there
was
will
all
be
changed.
secret teachings and secret knowledge that
Yeah.
therefore reconciles you with God and puts you in a different sort of category of eliteness or
Yeah. It was more of a
special
Gnostic-
favorness.
Gnostic view
It
of
does
things.
have a lot of continuity with early Gnostic
Gnosticism.
Christian.
Okay.
Yes.
So anyway, that's a good idea. Hopefully this helped you out to think a little differently, because we really are here not to completely bash Mormons. We don't like to do that, but we are here to educate. We're the power of knowledge, the power of exposure, the power of influence in the sense of understanding this view here is powerful to make a better decision upon your place and why you believe what you believe. If you have people saying these type of things, it's important for you now to investigate it, what Bryan has said. And if Bryan's wrong, then so be it.
So be it.
But if he's right, then I think it's well worth your position, if you're LDS, to say, yeah, why do we have a temple?
Yeah.
Why are we spending $33 to $50 million for each temple that's being built? $5 billion that could maybe go to another place that could help help the world in a different place, right? Very important idea. Anyway, we hope that you like this show. Thank you again, Bryan, for coming here and sharing this very wise information. So grateful for this man. He has so much intelligence and understanding, and very thankful, and he's very humble with this knowledge. But hopefully this has helped you, and God bless you guys, and thanks for watching.
God bless.